Welcome to our audience and welcome to our guests who have graciously joined us today for a conversation about a recent report that has been released by UNESCO on the Indigenous peoples and the media. I'm Bryan Pollard. I'm the Grant Operations Manager here at the Associated Press and a citizen of the Cherokee Nation. I'm joined today by Kelly Williams, who is the Director of First Nations Strategy at the Australian Broadcasting Corporation, and Shane Taurima, Chief Executive at Whakaata Māori.
Kia ora.
Thank you for joining us. The reason that we're here today is to talk a little bit about this study that was recently released by UNESCO, which is intended to be basically a status on the implementation of Article 16. And I'm going to go ahead and read Article 16 so that our audience knows what it is that we're talking about and kind of what the foundation of this study is. So, Article 16 of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples reads, Indigenous peoples have the right to establish their own media in their own languages and to have access to all forms of non-Indigenous media without discrimination. States shall take effective measures to ensure that state-owned media duly reflect Indigenous cultural diversity. States, without prejudice to ensuring full freedom of expression, should encourage privately owned media to adequately reflect Indigenous cultural diversity. Our organizations, we all participated in giving feedback to this study, and so we're going to talk about what we feel about the study that's been released. My first question to each of you is to kind of set the scene for our audience. Tell us a little bit about your community and the role that media plays there, and what does media mean to your communities? Kelly, we'll start with you.
For me, well, first off, I would like to acknowledge the Lenape people on whose land that we're on today. I'd like to acknowledge their elders and their continued connection to the land and waters of where we are. I'd like to extend that acknowledgement to my elders of the Bundjalung Nation in the Northern Rivers area on the east coast of Australia. So my first impression about the report was it was a little shorter than I thought it was going to be. I thought the data that they included in that was good, and I think for me what stood out the most was the lack of engagement from non-Indigenous media orgs that was clearly shown in that data. I think it might have been nicer to have maybe a little bit more around the work that Indigenous media organisations do. But, you know, maybe this is because it's the beginning of the conversation. But, yeah.
So Shane, tell us a little bit about your community, what the role that media plays in your community.
So I'm Māori, the Indigenous people of Aotearoa, New Zealand, and I descend from ancestors on the east coast of the North Island, Rongomaiwahine and Kahungunu. The Māori people are a very proud people, as we all are, as Indigenous peoples, and have a place within society in Aotearoa, New Zealand. We're about 16% of the population, roughly 800,000, and that continues to climb. We're a very young population, so the average age is under 25. So we have a relatively young population, which makes media even more important for our communities. Media has played a very important role in our community for a very long time. We've had a form of presence on non-Indigenous media, our public broadcaster, for more than 60 odd years, and then had the opportunity to deliver our own, first of all through tribal radio, which we still currently have, and also via television, which I'm privileged to be able to run as the Chief Executive of Whakaata Māori, previously known as Māori Television. Earlier this year in March we celebrated 21 years, and I was listening to you, Bryan, read out a reference to the UNDRIP there, and I suppose you could say that Whakaata Māori is one of the many Indigenous media and broadcasters that give effect to or try to give effect, if I can frame it like that, to what you've just read out.
So tell us a little bit more about your role in your organization and maybe your journey to getting to where you are today and what your day-to-day looks like at your organization.
Well, by trade, I'm a journalist. I've spent just over 30 years in the sector, so have worked in front of the camera, behind the scenes, and now have the privileged role of Chief Executive. And we were just talking earlier, actually, it seems depending on how you look at it and how you may move across the food chain, but the higher up you get, the further away you get from content, which is the primary reason I actually got into the industry. The privilege and the opportunity to be able to tell our stories in our own ways, in our language. That's the primary reason why I got into the industry. And now of course, being Chief Executive, I don't have that opportunity as much as I used to be able to.
Is it safe to say that your preference is still to be behind the camera rather than in front of the camera?
Well, it depends, really. I think the magic of what we do is in the way in which we tell our stories, the way in which we engage with our people and our communities, the way in which we're able to share their stories with a wider audience to bring about appreciation and value of who we are as a people, but also of our language and culture. So that's something that I'm still proud about doing, but just in a different role.
Yeah. Kelly, same question to you. Tell us about your role at the Australian Broadcasting Corporation and how it has influenced Indigenous coverage.
Well, I'm fairly new in my role. I'm about 6 months in. I'm the ABC's first director, First Nation strategy in its 92-year history. It's been a long journey for me to get to there. I started with the ABC in 1988. We were just talking about that as well, around how your career changes the more you focus on what you feel is important for your community. So for me, I've always believed the Australian Broadcasting Corporation, or the ABC, as a national broadcaster, it's incumbent upon national broadcasters to, reflect all of Australian society and to be that voice for, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities who, whilst have had their own media for a very long time, it's a very strong First Nations media sector in Australia, but it's extending that conversation into a national conversation instead of just a community conversation. And so a few years ago, I developed a strategic partnership between the ABC and First Nations Media Australia, and then developed consecutive reconciliation action plans with the focus on incorporating Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander languages and language speakers into ABC content. So I think this Director First Nation strategy is a development of that work, but also around a movement that started with our Bonner Committee. It's our peak Indigenous reference group at the ABC. They called for an independent review into the systems and processes for ABC employees who suffer racism. And so one of the recommendations in that report was for this position and for an elder in residence, and then to develop 15 recommendations. So a lot of the work I do as part of that implementation framework is ensuring that the ABC is representative of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. So it's getting people into senior executive roles. We have 16 senior executive Indigenous employees at the ABC.
So you shared with us kind of in your opening remarks, kind of your first impressions of the study.
Yeah.
I'd like to ask the same question of you though, Shane. Kind of what are your first thoughts now that you've seen the study that it was just released in the last few days?
So It was 2 years ago, actually, that I was last here in New York at the UN, where we co-hosted with this organisation as well, a session where, for the very first time, Indigenous media was being discussed at the Permanent Forum, which is surprising as I say that. And as a direct outcome of that conversation, the resolution was adopted by the forum for a study, a global study to be commissioned. And so UNESCO was tasked with doing that. So I think the report that's being tabled this week affirms what many of us know and have lived for many years, and that is that Indigenous media is essential, is impactful, but unfortunately is under-resourced, underfunded, and is often overlooked from a policy perspective and requires further structural change and support. So these things aren't new, but it is good that it is in a report that has been tabled, that is being tabled this week at the Permanent Forum. And I think what is going to be important is the action that now follows the report. We can't accept a one-off report. We need to see the recommendations, which I'm sure we're going to talk about today, being implemented and strong action being taken as well.
So, Kelly, the study offered 12 recommendations. Which of those recommendations resonates most with you and with your community?
I think for me it was recommendation 12 around partnerships and, you know, sort of working with communities. That's always been a really strong focus for me, is to bring those voices into national broadcaster. It can be a difficult line to tread as an Indigenous person in a mainstream media role, but needing to develop those pathways with First Nations media organisations. And so that has just resonated with pretty much my whole career at the ABC.
And Shane...
Oh, sorry.
Go ahead.
And I was going to say, it's vitally important for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities who have strong community voices, but they don't necessarily reach that national sort of level, that national conversation. And so amplifying those voices up to that audience and getting Indigenous perspectives around Indigenous issues told with Indigenous voices is, you know, for me, the best outcome we can get as a national broadcaster.
Which actually segues perfectly into my next question for you, Shane, which is another one of the recommendations was calling for ensuring fair representation in media content to prevent stereotypes and unfair representations of Indigenous people. Why do you feel like that's important?
Well, for far too long, Indigenous stories have been told by everyone but Indigenous people. And so it is important that we as Indigenous peoples assert ourselves and reclaim our narratives and take space. We're not going to ask for space, we need to take it. And that's what so many Indigenous media and broadcasting organisations are doing. And I just really want to acknowledge and recognise the amazing work that is being done in many communities across the globe. Because if there is one thing that was probably lacking in the report is a true reflection of the amazing work that we are seeing in our communities. And this is work that we're seeing in Aotearoa, New Zealand and Australia, right across the globe. So we need to acknowledge that work that's being done and the struggle that has taken place for the many gains and many outcomes that have been achieved over these years. We need to acknowledge and recognise those. Can I just also take the opportunity to answer your earlier question, because while all of the recommendations are important and equally important, and I agree too with Kelly's comment about partnerships, but I think funding and resource is a key recommendation in that regard. And we've heard a lot of it over the last few days at the Permanent Forum from other Indigenous media organisations. We ourselves at Whakaata Māori are also facing significant cuts shortly. while we are primarily government funded, we rely on that funding to be able to deliver the important work that we do. Now, with the significant cuts that we're facing, it's going to compromise what we're now able to deliver for our communities. So I just wanted to echo the recommendation around long-term investment, which is so fundamental to the important work that we do. And I'm looking forward to some strong action being taken in that regard.
Thank you, Shane. Kelly, having looked over the study, is there any subject matter that the study missed? Is there something, an issue that you think is important that wasn't addressed in the study that maybe you wish would have been there?
Yeah, I agree with Shane. So the one that kind of resonated with me the most was recommendation 7. It talks about, financial and structural constraints for Indigenous media organisations, and people might not be aware, but Australia had a referendum for an Indigenous voice in our parliament, which was resoundingly knocked back. It was a 60% no vote from the Australian public. And for me, if we are going to have a real conversation in Australia around treaty and truth-telling, we need to have ongoing unfettered funding for our First Nations media organisations. So for me, strengthening that wording in recommendation 7 to address that is what, for me, would have made that recommendation a little stronger. So maybe that's a conversation we have, as a starting point with this report.
Yeah, and I would echo that, in the U.S. in particular, given that my role here at the Associated Press is really working with philanthropy to ensure that philanthropy is stepping up to the plate to fund journalism. I think philanthropy also has an important role to play in supporting Indigenous media as well. So I have a question to both of you, and this has to do with our languages, which of course are vitally important to our communities. What role can or should Indigenous and non-Indigenous media play in supporting and preserving Indigenous languages? Kelly, we'll start with you.
I'll go back to my previous comment around, I think it is incumbent upon national broadcasters to include Indigenous languages in their content and in their coverage. The ABC has had successive Elevate reconciliation action plans. We have an organisation called Reconciliation Australia. They have a RISE framework. It's differing levels of reconciliation action plans. When you get to Elevate status, you have to have a vision, a transformation piece. And the transformation piece for the last 2 RAPs, we call them, that I've coordinated, has been the inclusion of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander languages to the extent the transformation piece is to have those languages and those place names included as part of our national vocabulary. For me, the importance of doing that, it then gives all Australians that connection to the country that they are living on, to the stories of the place where they reside. And that, for me, is true reconciliation.
If the goal is to ensure that our languages not only survive but thrive, then everyone has a role to play. Everyone has a role to play. And that includes Indigenous and non-Indigenous media organisations as well. But the point that I would also make, Bryan, is that it's not just about language, it's also about culture, it's about identity. And this is the fundamental role that Indigenous media organisations fulfil. It's about nation building. It's about reclaiming the narrative and being able to tell our stories from our perspectives in our languages. So yes, language is fundamentally important and critical to the role that we carry out and deliver, but it's also about our culture. It's about who we are as Indigenous peoples and our unique identity.
Thank you for that. I'd like to kind of circle our conversation back around to UNDRIP, which affirms, among other things, the fundamental right to Indigenous self-determination. So I'd like to hear from each of you how you think Indigenous media supports or reaffirms Indigenous self-determination. We'll start with you, Shane.
I think self-expression is the foundation of self-determination. It's about us determining what our future looks like, not a predetermined, imposed future, but actually us being empowered and enabled as Indigenous peoples to be the masters of our own destiny. And that's what we're able to reflect, not fully achieve as Indigenous media organisations, but that's what we're able to support. And I think we contribute to the narrative as well as understanding. And that's not only just for non-Indigenous people, I think it's for Indigenous people as well, especially for those that are reconnecting with who they are. We have to acknowledge the terrible histories that many of us and many of our peoples have suffered over many years. So it's about rebuilding, it's about reasserting who we are as Indigenous peoples. And one of the ways that we do that is by using media as such a powerful tool, as we know.
And Kelly, so what do you think is the role media can or should play in reaffirming self-determination?
Again, I'll come back from a public broadcaster point of view of being an Indigenous person in that industry. From an employment perspective, I suppose, storytelling in a public broadcaster as an Indigenous journalist is to make sure that we have Indigenous-led initiatives, especially around those big conversations that affect Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. It's also looking at the way the ABC tells those stories, and especially around that deficit narrative. So often you will see in mainstream media, Aboriginal people are the most incarcerated people, in the country. When you go to community, First Nations community organisations, that narrative is very different. Those media organisations are talking about the fantastic work that their communities are doing to address, those issues. And they are coming from a strength-based perspective on those things. And so it's, for me, it's ensuring that as a national broadcaster, the ABC is also coming from that strength-based narrative. And that, for me, is about self-determination. It is saying that these communities are achieving great things on their own with just having elders and the community working together to address, social injustice. And the rest of Australia, when they hear that, it changes their mind from being most incarcerated to we are leading the way in doing the work ourselves.
Can I also just say, Bryan, as I'm listening to Kelly's wonderful commentary, I reflect on the fact that many Indigenous media organisations and practitioners have themselves been born out of self-determination. Many of the organisations, including Whakaata Māori, has born out of struggle, but also out of the aspiration that we know what is best for our communities. We're best to tell our own stories. And that in itself is a real expression of self-determination. And so it's right that we acknowledge and recognise that self-determination has been around and being practiced across Indigenous media organisations for a very long time.
Thank you for that. So I have one more question for each of you just to close out our conversation. If you were standing in front of the Permanent Forum or the United Nations now and you could make one recommendation, maybe drawn from the study or maybe just a recommendation that you would want to share with them, what would it be? Shane, we'll start with you.
I think the message is simple. If you believe in the value and the power of Indigenous media, then you need to set it up and support it to succeed. And while there are countless examples of success being experienced across the globe, there is so much more to be done. And we've touched on some of the recommendations today. But I actually want to focus on the amazing work that is actually taking place now and has been for so many, many years. We are where we are, and we've made considerable gains in this media space because we've asserted ourselves and we've taken ownership and taken space. We need to continue to do that. So I'm not necessarily relying on the UN to further support that, let me reframe that. I'm not relying on the UN or any UNESCO report to validate the amazing work that has been done and continues to be done. My expectation, though, is that they continue to support it and enable and empower us to continue to do our jobs and do them well.
Thank you. Kelly, would you have a recommendation?
I do. I'm going to extend on that awesome point that Shane just made. I think for me, the biggest benefit, the most joy that I get from my job is working with other Indigenous media organisations and other Indigenous media professionals. And for me, I think if UNESCO would, and I have said this when we were in Paris, if UNESCO makes the space, you know, we will come and fill that. But it needs to be from that strength-based perspective. And I often think we're a lot of small voices around the world, but if we could combine those voices together, if we could be more collaborative, if we could share each other's stories, we have similar experience and such a depth of professionalism around the world. How amazing would it be if we were able to collaborate on a regular basis? That to me would be the dream.
Totally agree. One final comment if I could make, Bryan, please.
Absolutely.
We have a saying at home, nothing for us without us. Any solution, any next step, any further action that we see must be Indigenous-led and, as Kelly says, strengths-based, so that we celebrate and acknowledge what works and what the solutions are, because we have the solutions. We just need the resource to be able to implement and resolve them.
And we'll close our conversation with that. Thank you, Shane Taurima and Kelly Williams. Thank you for joining us, and we'll see you out in the field.
Thank you.
Thank you, Bryan.
Welcome to our audience and to our guests for today's conversation about a study that has recently been released by UNESCO on Indigenous peoples and the media. I'm Bryan Pollard. I'm a grant operations manager here at the Associated Press and a citizen of the Cherokee Nation. I'd like to introduce our guest today, Sunnie Clahchischiligi, who is an Indigenous Affairs editor at High Country News and a board member for the Indigenous Journalists Association, and Tristan, editor-at-large at Grist. So I'd like to kind of start off with each of you kind of describing your communities and what Indigenous media play, the role that it plays in your community and why it's important. Sunnie?
Well, I come from a community of less than 500 people, so I think that information is crucial for that reason. A very rural community, which is not very different from the other communities on the Navajo Nation. And so information and access to information is important because we need to know what's going on, essentially. And it's also important because it's a way of connectivity. It's kind of what keeps the community connected to one another because we're so rural. The Navajo Nation, for those who know, spans 3 states, and so to know what's happening in one part of it, it helps to have a way to do that. But the Navajo people are also very widespread. We're not just bounded within the reservation boundaries, but we're also everywhere, essentially, which is kind of a running joke. But yeah, so it is important to us in that way.
And Tristan?
Well, I'm a member of the Kiowa tribe. Our homelands are in Oklahoma. Traditionally, those homelands range from more or less West Texas all the way up to what's currently Kansas. Journalism has really always been fairly integral in my tribe. Even most recently in our recent history with the Kiowa newspaper, which has been in publication since the early 1900s, still in publication now. It's been really a vital resource for all of us to be able to see what's going on in the community, stay connected to each other, and we're a small tribe as well, so we would like to know what we're all up to and doing. So it's a small community newspaper, but has really been integral, I think, to our voices and our history, and preserving our history, and informing people about what our leaders are up to and what our community members are up to.
And tell us a little bit about your role right now at Grist, and kind of what has been your journey to get to where you are today, and how do you, in your current role, kind of support Indigenous media?
Well, I'm editor-at-large at Grist. We're an outlet, nonprofit outlet focused on climate and the environment. I run our Indigenous Affairs desk, a small team of 4 reporters and editors combined. Essentially I got there, I've been working more or less in mainstream media most of my career. My first job was with PBS NewsHour when it was still with Jem Lear. Have been working in public television, public radio, online journalism, magazines, even some broadcasts with Al Jazeera America. So my work has really been focused in mainstream outlets, and I think that's been a very particular sort of pressure cooker, I guess you could say, in terms of my thinking around Indigenous journalism and how to support Indigenous journalists. So the current iteration, I think, in my career has been to really be thinking about the impacts of climate and environment on Indigenous communities, but not just in the U.S., globally, since climate change is a global issue. It's something that we need to think about globally, and think critically about the unique ways in which it impacts Indigenous peoples, as well as the proposed solutions to climate change and how they impact Indigenous peoples.
And Sunnie, same question to you. Tell us a little bit about your role at High Country News and your role at the Indigenous Journalists Association, and a little bit about your journey that got you there, and kind of the role that you're playing to support Indigenous media.
Yeah, so at High Country News, I work as the Indigenous Affairs editor. We're really just overseeing the Indigenous Affairs desk. That is made up of 2 full-time reporters and also a fellow. So we have a new fellow this year, and we essentially cover all that is Indigenous news related within the West. We're not confined to that, of course, so we look for opportunities to make connections beyond those boundaries. And at the Indigenous Journalists Association, I am a board member, entering my 3rd term, I believe, at the start of my 3rd term. And they're just helping where I need it, essentially. So doing a lot of work that's trying to push the organization along, essentially. In terms of my journey, pretty eclectic. I started out pretty young, at 19 in journalism, really in mainstream news organizations, newspapers mostly. But because of that, wanted to take on a role in tribal media, and officially started my career with the Navajo Times back home. So moved home and did that for over a decade. Then decided to get a little crazy and went to school again. And so I'm also an academic, so I'm a working rhetorician, composition instructor at Arizona State University, while doing all of these wonderful things at High Country News and IJA. So I have a background in sports writing mostly, but have done just about every type of reporting that there is.
Thank you. So let's kind of jump into the study that was recently released. And the purpose of the study was kind of to do a status on the implementation of Article 16 in the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And I'll go ahead and read Article 16 to kind of set the stage here. Indigenous peoples have the right to establish their own media in their own languages, and to have access to all forms of non-Indigenous media without discrimination. States shall take effective measures to ensure that state-owned media duly reflect Indigenous cultural diversity. States, without prejudice to ensuring full freedom of expression, should encourage privately owned media to adequately reflect Indigenous cultural diversity. So, question to each of you, since you've seen the study, what were your first impressions of the study, and kind of what stood out to you the most? Tristan?
Well, I mean, it's interesting that you read Article 16 and the content of it, because I think what the report sort of clearly outlines is that none of that is happening. You know, access is limited, stereotypes are rampant. You know, this is something that struck me, was that a lot of the content in the report are things that Indigenous reporters and journalists have been talking about for years, and that I think it highlights just how far member states and media organizations have to go to even get anywhere near you know, satisfying Article 16 of UNDRIP. I find that maybe one of the most interesting things about the report at this time. In terms of sort of thinking about what should be in the report or coming up, I mean, I think one of the things and one of the concerns that I have is that the lumping of Indigenous media together with journalism. There is no, there's essentially no distinctions made for Indigenous journalism, and I think this is to our detriment to be able to say that television production or fiction television production is on equal footing as investigative Indigenous journalists, for instance, right? These are both obviously incredibly important to our nations and to our futures, but when it comes to the sort of work that we need to be doing, and especially in growing authoritarian climate around the world, Indigenous journalists need to be protected, they need to be recognized, and I think this report could go a little bit further in terms of making sure that we have a more secure future as Indigenous journalists.
I'll ask you about that next, so we'll come back around to that. But Sunnie, what were your early impressions of the report?
Yeah, I think in a word, underwhelmed. I think that there were, as Tristan said, there was a lot of knowns already that exist in what was depicted in the report. But I think that the fact that there is a report is something that could be said on a positive note, that it's written down somewhere that these are things that are necessary, things that we're continuing to lack. But I also think that it would be nice to see the work more obvious that Indigenous journalists are doing, to get a sense of what's behind the statistics, if you will, a little bit more qualitative research in that sense, because we are talking about an industry that focuses on storytelling, and so I feel that some of that information could be emulated in that way.
And it should be noted that the draft report that we had a chance to review was considerably more expansive than the final report that has been released. So, Tristan, circling back to your point that you made a minute ago, what do you feel is missing from the study? What part of what we saw in the draft report that maybe didn't make it to the final report stood out to you as being the most important thing that's missing?
Well, I think, again, that distinction for journalism, I think it's hugely, hugely important. But I think also all of the stories and background and the more expansive report is missing. I mean, there were stories from Cambodia, from Latin America, success stories about how Indigenous media and journalists were essentially thriving and doing great work. I think that's really important for people to be able to see, and I think it's important for us all to be able to learn from when we can sort of see what our colleagues in our countries or other parts of the world are being able to do. So I think it's vitally important to see that. Yeah, I would say that that's the big one right now.
Okay, thank you. So, Sunnie, shifting focus to tribal media here in the U.S., one of the recommendations in the report is to ensure impartial Indigenous media and the prevention of interference, including from tribal councils, in that impartial media. How do you view the state of an impartial Indigenous media in the U.S., and why is it important to freedom of expression and reliable access to information?
Well, I think that the fact that we're still, as Indigenous journalists, we're still having conversations about free press and its necessity, I think that speaks to the state. There are still battles being had, and we're still having to explain the need for free expression, the need for access and reliable information, or reliable access to information. And so I think that that alone speaks for itself, just the fact that we're having those conversations. And I think that why it's important is really just because it's our inherent right to that, to be able to express ourselves in a way that is in tune with the way that we know how to express ourselves. And so I think that that's what Indigenous journalism does. It provides an avenue, or provides a way to relay information that is received well by its audience. So it's for Indigenous communities by Indigenous people. And so I think that there's something very tailored in that way. And so I think that to be able to have that is important. But also the idea of reliable access to information. We could all use reliable access to information. And so I think that, when I mentioned my community earlier, it's a very small place. And so you want the most reliable information if there's only one avenue in which you're getting that. And so I think that it's not just something that everyone should have. I think it's just an inherent right to be able to have that kind of access to information.
And you and I we share a background in tribal media. You work at the Navajo Times, I worked at the Cherokee Phoenix. Is there a free press in Indian country? What is the state of press freedom in Indian country?
I mean, when there's no, that's my short answer is no, because while there are things that have been put into place, for example, at the Navajo Times, they separated themselves from the council, but it doesn't stop there, because there are no laws put in place that say that tribal people in official capacities have to speak to the media, or that documents need to be provided, or things of that nature. And so there isn't a full free press, and it's something that we still are working towards.
So Tristan, there's another recommendation in the study that calls for the strengthening of partnerships and professional networks. Tell us a little bit about your work with the newly formed Indigenous News Alliance, and also the collaboration that's happening here at the Permanent Forum. What are some of the benefits and the challenges to sustaining those kinds of partnerships?
Well, for the last about 4 years, Grist has been covering the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues. And over those years, we've always invited our Indigenous colleagues to come and co-report in the space. So it's bringing in other newsrooms, other Indigenous affairs desks, and we more or less always sort of create a pooled reporting environment in which we can all work together as sort of a large team. We sort of jokingly call it sort of like a super group that sort of forms of like Indigenous affairs desks from around the country. And we've been doing this for a number of years, and it's been one of the many inspiration points to pull together and launch the Indigenous News Alliance, which takes that idea and essentially aims to globalize it and have it exist outside of the UN space. So that will be bringing in partners like High Country News, the AP, to be able to share content, share stories, Indigenous stories, with the longer term goal of being able to do more cross-border collaboration. So right now we're making sure that we can share all of our content between each other, sort of an Indigenous news wire, if you will. Again, with larger goals of being able to work on larger projects on issues that impact Indigenous peoples around the world. So, and obviously the benefit of that is that, and as the report points out, is that we've been locked out of mainstream news outlets for more or less the entire existence of the United States. That is not going to be changing anytime soon. Even with the push for diversity and inclusion over the last few years, we've seen very, very little movement from large news organizations to bring Indigenous journalists into their newsrooms. We think that being able to have a partnership like this helps us to more or less say, we don't need you anymore. We can do this work on our own. We can do it together, and we can find value in the stories that your organizations have not. Essentially, it's the sort of idea of stronger together. So we're excited to see where all of this will go in the future. But you know, we've been able to do some really exciting test runs here at the UN, and we're looking forward to doing more. And we have stories coming out all through this week and next, and we'll probably have stories coming out for the foreseeable future together.
So tell us a little bit more about the collaboration that you put together here at the UN and how it's kind of developed over the years, and how is it going this year? Have you been supported by the UN? Has it been difficult? What are the challenges? What have been some of the successes?
Yeah, I mean, over the years we've had some very good relationships in being able to do this coverage. So we're covering everything from critical minerals to threats against attendees at the UN for calling out their member states. This year we focused on our opening story about how the Trump administration's crackdown on immigration has put a fairly large damper on attendance at the UN. So, you know, each year I think we get sharper and sharper about how we can create stories that are going to be viable for all of our news outlets, finding the different things that are going to make a local audience interested as well as a broader national or international audience. So it is sort of the cliche of sort of thinking locally and acting globally. In terms of our time at the UN, I mean, the United Nations is a hostile environment to Indigenous reporters. It generally has been. I think we've been able to find some workarounds with some individuals inside that have been really helpful in terms of making sure that we have access to the proceedings so that we can cover those proceedings unfettered. But, you know, we still run into arbitrary rules in which Indigenous journalists are not allowed into particular spaces. So we have to work with that, and we have to work around that. And we hope that continued dialogue with the UN will help to assuage those problems in the future. And we also hope that reports like this by the UN saying that there needs to be support for Indigenous journalism may move the organization to assist with that. Most major newsrooms have desks within the UN, both in New York and Geneva. It's a perfect opportunity to be able to provide space to Indigenous journalists to be able to be in those spaces permanently and covering the events that impact us. There's so much policy that goes on here that impacts us on a day-to-day basis. It's sort of a no-brainer, I think, on the UN's part to make sure that we have access to that reporting and that we can provide that information to our readers and audiences.
Thank you. Sunnie, a question to you, kind of shifting gears to language. What role can or should Indigenous media play in preserving Indigenous languages? And how do you see this affecting our communities?
You know, I think if you look in the report and the discussion around radio, it's pretty imminent that language is a very significant part. And I think that media should play a huge role in that, in supporting that, because I think for a lot of, not all, but for a lot of Indigenous communities, we are orators first. And so there's a connection between identity and language. And so it's, for a lot of people, you can't separate that. Identity is language. And so I think that it's important in that sense, but also it's been said that as Indigenous people, we first think Indigenous, and we think better within our language, or when we use our language, and for a lot of us it's easier. For example, my first language is not English, and so things come easier to me within my own Indigenous language. And I think that there's so much hindrance in having to translate. A lot gets lost in translation as well. And so I think that in order to really have a true sense of what people are saying and how they feel and how they're expressing themselves, language is a huge part in that, and being able to do that within Indigenous languages. And so I see it as really just a vehicle to revitalization, a vehicle to preservation even. And so I think that what a lot of media outlets are already doing in kind of harnessing the use of Indigenous languages is great. I think it should be continued. I mean, that's something, in fact, that I'm trying to do now at High Country News, is kind of taking it to the next step and not just using the language, but not even having to translate the language. And because there's so much access to information out there that people can figure out what that is, just the way that we have to look up a word if we don't know it in the English language. And so, so language is important. It's mostly because it's tied to identity. And if we want to talk about what's important for Indigenous people, then we can't do that without talking about language.
Absolutely, and I know that when we were at the Cherokee Phoenix, we made language a real priority, not only for people who were able to read printed Cherokee, but all those that wanted to learn Cherokee. It became a learning tool, and so I think it's incredibly valuable. So focusing back on the study, a question to each of you: if there was a follow-up study, so this study, when you look at it, it's very kind of general, and it touches on 12 recommendations. But if there was a follow-up study that focused on a specific area, what would that be for you, Sunnie?
I think that a lot of what we decide as a focus of interest is really just speaks to our experiences. And I think that for me, I'm really interested in framework, looking at the framework in terms of editorial framework and legal. I think there was some notes in there in the recommendation about Indigenous media professionals having a say in what that looks like. So I'd be particularly interested in not just what that could look like, but how do we get there? And so I'm curious on that from the legal standpoint and how we could have a role in making some of those decisions, but also from the editorial standpoint. Because again, this is something, part of the work that I try to do at High Country News is having a say in what I like to call indigenizing media rather than decolonizing media. And so making it look and making the framework more sustainable for the kind of work that we're doing. Because right now it's like fitting a circle into a shape that's entirely different than what it needs to be. And so, which can be pretty hard. And so we're having to create policies and having to create guidelines that are more suitable for how we do our work. And so I'm particularly interested in those two areas.
And Tristan, if there was an area that could be more sharply focused on, what would that be?
Well, again, I think it would be Indigenous journalism. This idea that Indigenous journalism, serves self-determination and sovereignty is one that I think everybody, or nearly everybody, during the report and the drafting of the report talked about. It's journalism that unapologetically focuses on stories and needs of Indigenous readers. If I'm thinking of sort of how to make an analogy of that, if I'm thinking of sort of like language, like Indigenous journalism isn't just sort of a dialect of like Western journalism. Indigenous journalism is its own language. It has its own rules. It does things differently, and it acts differently. Its goals are different. At least here in the United States, journalism is seen as upholding democracy. I believe that that's something that Indigenous journalism does also, but again, our focus is on our self-determination and sovereignty. And that makes it fundamentally different than what our Western or mainstream colleagues practice. And that's, so being able to look more deeply into that, look at that as distinct practice, and again start working toward protections, toward supports, and toward nurturing that, I think is exactly where we need to be going to be bringing up the next generation of Indigenous journalists, but also being able to bring them up in a generation that not only supports them for essentially being different, but also gives them protections for being different. I mean, if you want, as Indigenous peoples, if you want to treat us equally, you have to be prepared to treat us differently. And I think this goes through journalism as well. And I think that it's a missed opportunity not to lean into that and make sure that we're starting that conversation now, because I don't expect another survey like this or report like this to happen for up to another decade. That means it's on us to continue to push that.
And thank you for mentioning the importance of how this all kind of affirms self-determination, because it brings me to my last question for each of you. So UNDRIP, which is the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, affirms, among other things, the fundamental right to Indigenous self-determination. How do you see Indigenous and non-Indigenous media supporting this fundamental right to self-determination? Sunnie, we'll start with you.
Well, I think Tristan couldn't have said it better in terms of accepting it for what it is and not trying to make it something else. You know, it's its own kind of breed, Indigenous journalism, and so I think that, which is a really hard concept for a lot of people, because I think when you think about journalism in the first place, it's Western journalism. It's got its own idealistic idealism connected to it, and so I think that how do you support that? By, I guess, listening to the people who are doing it, getting an understanding of what that looks like from our perspectives, those who have been doing the work, who have been pushing some of the efforts. And so, because I think there are small things, and then there are big things. And I think that the first step is being open to that, because I think that we're talking about an institution essentially. And so the field itself is institutionalized, and so having to change that is a really difficult thing. And so I think that there's a number of ways to do that, but I think the biggest thing is, first and foremost, understanding that it's something within itself.
Thank you. Tristan, how should Indigenous and non-Indigenous media support self-determination?
Well, again, it's by doing the work that we already do. It's by holding our leaders accountable. It's by informing our communities of the events that are going on. It's by telling stories like we've always done. I would say it's how Indigenous journalism or Indigenous journalists support self-determination or sovereignty. It's something that we're already doing. So I would actually flip that question back to organizations like the United Nations or even mainstream news outlets about what will you do to support that as well. You know, again, there are so many opportunities for us to be partners and for us to work together as Indigenous and non-Indigenous reporters in newsrooms. Every day there is another opportunity to make a change and decide to do something different and say, you know what, today we're going to work with this Indigenous Affairs desk that knows what they're doing in this area, and we're going to put out the best possible product. And that can happen any day of the week. It doesn't require any effort except for an editor to make that decision. That can happen anytime. So I would say, again, supporting, protecting, nurturing Indigenous journalism is more or less what anybody can be doing when it comes to supporting self-determination and sovereignty. And I'll leave it at that.
Sounds great. Thank you for that response, and that will be our final word for today's conversation. Sunnie and Tristan, thank you both for joining us and for helping to illuminate our audience about the importance of Indigenous media. That's all the time we have for today. Thanks for watching. Thanks to the crew here at the Associated Press for lending their time and their studio to us. And thank you to our partners, the Indigenous Journalists Association, Grist, UNESCO, the Canadian Commission for UNESCO, and the Indigenous News Alliance.